And one of the arguments from OIDA and people that are against speed limiters is we have to remember the whole kind of trucking landscape. And what do we have? Truckers are paid by the mile, right? Okay, so if you're traveling in a 75 mile an hour zone and you're making a truck not able to go any faster than 60.
Yeah.
Okay, that's costing them money, correct?
Yep.
We can all agree on that. So what happens when you get in that 50 mile an hour zone?
Trying to make up time.
That truck is likely, human nature.
Yeah.
They are incentivized to go 60 or as fast as they can go through it. If you speed limit them down to 65.
And we're back. Time now to run down some of the biggest stories in trucking over the past couple of weeks with the brain trust of Landline Magazine, Mark Schremmer, Tyson Fisher. You've heard them laughing there already, emerging from their caves with fresh data, fresh takes, and they join us now. How you doing, gentlemen?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Before we start running here, I want to play a clip from a House T&I subcommittee hearing that took place on Wednesday. You may have heard OIDA Executive Vice President Louis Pugh testifying there. Mark, there was one exchange from the hearing that I know you were paying close attention to. We're going to play this first. This is Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts making the case for speed limiters on heavy trucks.
I understand that. That makes sense. You mentioned that it must be special interest groups or whatnot who are pushing these technologies. In the last year for which we have data available, 20% of fatal truck crashes occurred over speeds of 70 miles per hour, resulting in about 1,000 deaths.
All right, Mark, there it is. I'm going to let you take the ball and run with it because I know you got some thoughts here.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of where sometimes statistics and something that's just kind of set off the cuff is really taken out of context and misleading. What we have here, if you're listening to that quote, what do you think? You think that he is citing that this many trucks were speeding or going 70, 75 miles an hour down the highway and were involved in fatal crashes. But that's not the statistic that he's citing. FMCSA, back when they started this whole speed limiter rulemaking, which is what he's advocating for here, is they launched a statistic from 2019 that showed that 860 trucks that were traveling in a 70 or 75 mile an hour speed limit were involved in a fatal crash that year. I reached out to FMCSA back then to ask about this. Okay, how fast were these trucks actually going? They had no clue. They did not have that information. They didn't know how fast they were. How many of these trucks were speed limited? They did not have the answer to that question. So you have what they are calling a problem of 860 trucks in 70, 75 mile an hour zones were involved in fatal crashes. So what do we need to do? The solution in their mind is to speed limit these trucks. The problem is all of those trucks could have been speed limited theoretically. Mm-hmm. We have no idea how many of them were speed limited. They could have been traveling 60 miles an hour. They don't know. But the solution to the problem is something that may have already occurred. But the reality is that's also kind of left out of this is also from 2019, FMCSA came out and said 90.6% of the trucks involved in these crashes, no moving violations, no problem. So it's, again, this quote is giving this idea that these trucks are just barreling down the highways at a horribly high rate of speed, but that's not what was going on.
Right, and that's a frustrating thing I think about this conversation with speed limiters, and we saw it play out really in that congressional hearing there within the T&I subcommittee, was that you've got these two sides, and despite the numbers being misquoted, for one, is frustrating. But then just the fact that the numbers don't seem to matter to the people who are, and they've got the stance and they're staying on it, and I kind of understand it because in theory it sounds like it makes sense. Right, but when you look at the numbers, it doesn't. Yeah,
and let's going back to those numbers, going even further. So, also in that quote, he says 20% of these crashes, of fatal crashes are in these speed limits.
Right.
What he's leaving out is that the majority of crashes, 33.3%, are actually in 50 and 55 mile an hour zones. And let's also kind of add in this idea. One of the arguments from OIDA and people that are against speed limiters is we have to remember the whole kind of trucking landscape. And what do we have? Truckers are paid by the mile, right? Okay, so if you're traveling in a 75 mile an hour zone and you're making a truck not able to go any faster than 60.
Yeah.
Okay, that's costing them money, correct?
Yep.
We can all agree on that. So what happens when you get in that 50 mile an hour zone?
Trying to make up time.
That truck is likely, human nature.
Yeah.
They are incentivized to go 60 or as fast as they can go through it if you speed limit them down to 65. And so while 860 crashes were in 70 and 75 mile an hour zones in 2019, 1,491 were in 50 and 55 mile an hour zones. And what we're also seeing, we also have statistics that show that these large fleets that are speed limited, that I think Maverick and Trucking Alliance had come out with something about a year ago that said 98% of our trucks are speed limited, and they're advocating of how much safer this is. We found hundreds of speeding violations and crashes for these trucks.
Yeah.
They're still speeding.
Right.
They're just speeding in different zones.
Yeah.
And actually more dangerous zones that are more prevalent to have these fatal crashes because, construction, all of these different things that might be going on.
Right.
So you really do have to look at these, and you can't just hear one. I'm sure, the congressman thought they had a great soundbite there at the time.
Yeah.
But the reality is
The math doesn't work
Yeah.
out. Yeah. All right. Thus concludes our math portion of today's exam. Tyson, I want to talk to you about the Chevron doctrine, the decision there in the Supreme Court. We've talked about it on the show plenty of times, but essentially it's stripping the power of federal agencies to put these regulations into effect that are not mandated or given permission by Congress to do. There is a new angle to this, Tyson, and this has spurred some conversations, some action in Congress, right?
Yeah, so there is a coalition of Democrat senators and Bernie Sanders, but they introduced...
Caucuses with the Democrats, yep.
Yes, he does. Introduced a bill seeking to reform the regulatory process. So in their point of view, corporate interest groups have, hijacked the regulatory process while the general public remains largely uninvolved. So they're trying to fix that. And one way they want to fix that is they want to codify the Chevron doctrine, into federal law. So, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court, it dismantled that precedent that was set that gave power to federal agencies, took it away from them and into the hands of federal judges. This bill wants to basically, reinstate the Chevron doctrine via federal law. Which is the thing they can do if it gets passed. But it pretty much it resurrects this whole issue of the Chevron doctrine and puts it in the hands of Congress to do something about it, as opposed to the federal court system. So that's kind of what this bill is attempting to do.
It would basically put things back to where they were a month ago,
pretty
essentially.
Much, right. Yeah. And so, and there's pros and cons to that. The Democrats see it as that the Chevron doctrine was a good thing, so they want to put that back in place. And, mind you, this was precedent for 40 years. So for 40 years, this is how the federal government, ran in terms of, establishing certain types of regulations. So they just want to return to that status quo is one thing that they want to do.
Yeah, and one thing with all of this, and we heard some of this in the hearing this week about this. This is not going to go back to things like the ELD mandate. It's not going to be able to, overturn that or throw that out, right? We're looking to forward, whatever comes down the line here with regulations. We're not looking backward. So whatever happens with all of this, it's going to be what happens in the future. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. And there are some regulations that we can go back and challenge, not all.
Sure.
And then even then, there's a good chance that the federal courts would just say like, oh, no, we had it right the first time, so we're good to go. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of pieces to this, but essentially, yes, these Democrats want to put that status quo back into place. And then on top of that, they want to do further reform to the regulatory process. One thing they want to do is they want to expedite that process. So they want to allow courts to force agencies to start the rulemaking process if it has not done so within a year after that statute, given it the authority to do so, was put into place.
Yeah.
We see that all the time with agencies that are kind of just sitting on a directive to do something. But the thing is, there are a lot of reasons why they may do so, collecting information and stuff
Right.
like that.
Yep.
But a lot of interest groups saying, no, we wanted this rule, we want it now. Why are we sitting on this? And so this bill would say, all right, you got a year to do this.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
It would speed up the process there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of. I'm not very optimistic that this thing is going to pan out, but hey, I've been surprised before, I suppose. I want to shift real quick here, and we'll try to make some quick hits here. Truck Leasing Task Force, Mark, you've been following these meetings throughout. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau gave a presentation at the most recent one and kind of furthered the discussion, furthered what they had already been kind of saying here, that this model, the lease purchase model, is broken. That's the most.
Yeah,
I could use a lot of words there, but broken maybe.
I think kind of best way to kind of sum this up. So this presentation was slated to be a half hour, and it went more than an hour and a half. And it was just basically all the presentation was lining up all of the ways that these agreements are set up against the truck driver and why they're in a bad position. And this is just touching on the start of it, as the way the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put it. This is just the soup before the meal. This is the appetizer. They're going to have a report here in coming months that are going to outline all of the problems, just, so many terrible examples where, it's just a predatory scheme, and truck drivers, it needs to stop and they need to be protected. But it'll be interesting as we follow this.
Yeah, and I think they are going to be working through November.
But
that's
when they have to file the report.
It does seem like we're getting pretty close to a consensus here about changes being needed with this model.
100%.
We don't have a whole lot of time, Tyson, but I did want to talk to you about marijuana reclassification. Department of Justice moving that direction, obviously. A lot of concern in the trucking industry about what effect this might have on the industry. The comment period ended this past week, I believe, and OOIDA took a stance that basically reflects what the Department of Transportation is saying.
Right. So there was a lot of concern as how this rescheduling will affect the drug policy. Will marijuana remain illegal for truckers? So recently, Pete Buttigieg made some clarification saying basically this rescheduling will not affect the drug policy. And so in its comments, OOIDA basically said, yeah, we agree with that assessment. That's the way it should be. And I think at this point, everyone agrees with that. I think there's a pretty large consensus among everybody that truckers probably shouldn't,
shouldn't be smoking in the cab. I think that's pretty safe to say.
But with that said, it does open the door for that to be a possibility to modify. So that what OOIDA and other stakeholders want to see is a lot of things to be addressed, including impairment detection,
which we don't really have right now.
We do not have. So we have to consider that first and foremost. I think detection, and then impairment levels from there. But then they also bring up other good points, which is you also have to think about the medical benefits and then driver retention. These are all factors that need to be considered. But I mean, right now, as far as we know, is not going to directly affect the drug policy that the DOT has in place. And I think it's everyone agrees that let's try to make sure that remains the case moving forward.
Yeah, we were talking earlier. I'm not too concerned that you're going to have a whole bunch of people saying, yeah, that's fine for truck drivers to be smoking marijuana in the cab, right? I mean, I think everybody's on the same page here. Yeah. We don't want impaired driving.
Right.
It's just a matter of kind of finding the language and putting the rules in place.
And that's
right?
what the comment period for rulemakers are for, to address these issues. And so hopefully when the DEA, when or if they issue a final rule, they'll look at these comments like, yeah, maybe we should put in a provision that explicitly prohibits marijuana for, the DOT drug policies and other federal.
Yeah, a lot of interest in this topic. As you might imagine, there were, tens of thousands of comments, I think, on that. So not the end of this story, for sure, not the end of really any of these stories that we've talked about today. Mark, Tyson, we appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll step out for a minute, but we're back right after this.